Hello and welcome to episode 3 of this review. Alright, starting off with instructions. Basic operations hardwired and executed by the processor. A program is a sequence of instructions stored in memory as numbers. So an instruction comprises of several different parts. The first part here is the operation argument, and that tells the processor what it's supposed to do, what operation it's supposed to execute, and the rest of the arguments are operands, which feed into the operation. So variables, arguments, etc., and they can be either registers or immediate values. Now, a register is a small data holding unit inside the CPU itself, holds scratch variables and temporary data. Now, all instructions are fundamentally coded in binary and stored as binary numbers. Programs are stored as sequences of instructions in the memory. Now, these instructions are executed sequentially unless there is some kind of logic like jumps or function calls which aggregate and disrupt that linear flow, but it always goes from one instruction to the next sequentially where it can. And again, the instructions and the data related to the instructions are all stored in the main memory. And again, all of these things are worked on by the CPU, which brings us to our next idea, which is the von Neumann model. It is the model upon which all modern computers are built on. Important things to note here are that there is data transfer between the registers and the main memory, and that the instructions control the data flow between the memory and the registers, and what data is operated on in the registers. The control unit goes through instruction by instruction, executing those instructions, and it also, for each execution of each instruction, increments the program counter by 1, and by incrementing the program counter by 1, it can keep track of where it is in the list of instructions. Now, how the control unit deals with the instructions is called the instruction set architecture, and this has everything to do with all the instructions. So there are various trade-offs in performance, compactness, and programmability, how many different instructions, what level of operations, etc. The architecture is optimized most often not only for speed, but also for cost, power, and simplicity. Alright, let's talk about the main memory for a bit. The main memory in the architecture that we are studying, which is MIPS architecture, is 32 bits wide, which means for each data address, 32 bits can be stored at that address. And so data can be stored in 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit, and 64-bit chunks. However, the 64-bit chunks need to be stored in 2 different addresses. Instructions, on the other hand, are always 32 bits, which is the exact width of the memory. And they are always stored, always aligned on multiples of 4 in the addresses. Now a quick mention of the registers, which are the small temporary holding places for data in the CPU. 32 registers there are in the MIPS architecture that we are studying. Of those, 26 are available for general use. 4 are dedicated to special tasks like holding remainders and holding division results, and 2 are special with unique effects like $0. Now there are 3 distinct kinds of instructions. They all begin with an opcode, which specifies which operation the processor is supposed to execute. And they have up to 3 5-bit operand fields, which are basically the arguments for the operation. And they also have embedded constants, which can be immediate values and values that you can just pop in there, like 1, 5, 25, 94, whatever. Now, the PowerPoints do a pretty good job of explaining MIPS and how it works, so there are things in PowerPoints. I'm not going to go into it here in this video in detail because that would just be redundant and it'd be boring listening to me talk about all the MIPS instructions and MIPS for loops, etc., etc. So you can look up those on the PowerPoints. They're very well done. And that concludes episode 3. Come back in for episode 4, which will be about assessing modes.